Welcome to the Explainer. If you've ever felt completely overwhelmed by just the sheer volume of data we deal with in clinical settings, well, you're in exactly the right place today. We're going to be exploring a really brilliant series called the Vibe Rounds Cognitive Analytics Series. And look, this isn't just about, reading more medical journals. No way. This is about fundamentally restructuring how you actually think. We're going to approach this series as an architectural build for your clinical reasoning. We'll start from first principles and literally build all the way up to a practical framework you can start using right away. Okay, let's dive into this. Here's our blueprint for today. Section 1 covers our foundation, promption and provocation. Section 2 is anchoring to ground truth. Section 3 is weighting by case complexity. And finally, Section 4 will wrap it all up with the 10-minute self-audit. So let's start with Section 1, foundation, promption and provocation. Think about building a house, right? Before you can even think about putting up walls, you absolutely have to pour a solid concrete foundation. Well, to pour our cognitive foundation, this series introduces what we call a dual-mode architecture, promption and provocation. Everything we're talking about today rests entirely on these two cognitive modes. They are literally the twin engines of modern clinical reasoning when you're studying complex cases. Now, what's really interesting about this setup is how perfectly these two modes balance each other out. Promption is kind of like building a frame. You take this messy, chaotic clinical narrative and you scaffold it. You give it shape, you give it structure. But as we know, a frame isn't enough on its own. And that's exactly where provocation comes in. Provocation is the wind tunnel test. It's the active, aggressive stress testing of the hypothesis you've literally just built. You build it up with promption, and then you try to tear it down with provocation. So how does this actually play out in the real world? The source material anchors all this abstract theory with a fantastic worked case, a patient dealing with DKA and pneumonia. The authors walked this single case end-to-end through both modes. Promption scaffolded the narrative, and provocation tested it. And you know what happened? By using this dual-mode process, the system successfully surfaced a really vital HbA1c discrepancy. Honestly, if someone had just given a standard single-pass answer, they almost certainly would have missed it. This just proves right out of the gate why this dual-mode architecture is absolutely superior. All right, moving on to Section 2, anchoring to ground truth. Now that we've got our foundation set, we need to build upward. We do this by stacking layers of objective truth right on top of our cognitive modes. But here's the catch. As we add these three specific, structured layers to our clinical reasoning stack, the tooling and the complexity, well, they rise significantly. First, we integrate a knowledge graph, specifically for mapping out chronic kidney disease. Then we layer on an institutional pathway, looking at acute pancreatitis in this case. And finally, we stack on the appraised evidence. We're moving from pure thought patterns into heavy, localized, and literature-backed clinical machinery. But as you probably guessed, adding all this complexity always comes with a cost. Every single layer we just added fixes something highly specific, sure, but it immediately introduces a brand new risk. The knowledge graph brilliantly maps complex disease logic, but actually it risks oversimplifying the unique nuances of your actual patient. The institutional pathway, great for standardizing localized care, but man, it can quickly become way too rigid. I mean, anyone who's ever fought with an unyielding hospital protocol knows exactly what I'm talking about. And appraised evidence securely grounds your thinking in medical literature, but it inherently lacks the messy, real-world context of the human sitting right in front of you. Because of those differing risks, these layers will inevitably clash. They're going to disagree, and that is exactly what we want. Disagreement between these layers is a crucial signal worth surfacing. It's not a bug to smooth over. The friction between the graph, the pathway, and the evidence, that friction is the ultimate learning opportunity in this entire explainer. That is where real clinical reasoning happens. Which brings us to Section 3, weighting by case complexity. So the crucial point is, when those layers do disagree, which one actually wins the tiebreaker? To answer that, the authors propose an incredible if-then scenario. They cross a three-tier rarity framework against an evidence-based medicine, or EBM, task complexity axis. Simply put, if a case is rare and the task is complex, then your verification burden absolutely skyrockets. For a common, routine case, your verification burden is pretty low. But as cases become increasingly rare and complex, the burden of proof required from your ground truth layers gets incredibly high. The weight shifts depending entirely on the complexity of the task at hand. As we navigate this heavy verification burden, the series demands a really honest accounting of what this framework actually is right now. We have to separate the excitement of a proof of concept from the rigorous demands of validated science. Right now, this structured stack is an amazing proof of concept, but it requires a very honest accounting of its current limitations. To move this into fully validated science, well, that would require a robust, matched case series to truly validate the claims of accuracy. And even if we validated it perfectly, we still have to face this profound limitation highlighted in the source. Quote, a category of uncertainty, input curation, that no layer can ever reach. I really want you to think about that for a second. No matter how incredible our knowledge graphs are, no matter how rigorous our appraised evidence is, none of it can perfectly account for the human element of input curation. The initial information fed into the system by a human clinician carries a level of inherent uncertainty that no amount of heavy tooling or ground truth layers can ever fully eliminate. All right, let's shift gears for Section 4, the 10-minute self-audit. Let's all just take a breath. We've spent the last 3 sections building this massive, towering structure of cognitive layers. But let's be real for a second. If you're working a grueling clinical shift, running on stale coffee and zero sleep, you do not have time to run a matched case series in your head. 10. That is the number you need to remember. We need to cognitively reset right here. A massive analytical framework, no matter how brilliantly designed, is completely useless if it's too big, too heavy, or too complex to open every single week. If it takes you an hour, you're just not going to do it. But 10 minutes? 10 minutes changes everything. This entire piece asks a vital question. What does the smallest usable version of this whole stack look like? We're swapping out the formal studies, the complex graphs, and all that massive complexity for practical habits and a relentless focus on usability. We want habits over tooling. We are shrinking the stack down to a deliberately smaller, usable version that actually fits into your chaotic life. And this brilliantly illustrates your pocket-sized, boots-on-the-ground application of that massive cognitive stack we just built. Step 1, schedule a dedicated 10-minute weekly loop. Step 2, instead of writing a formal study, just write a simple one-line ledger detailing your promption and provocation thoughts. And step 3, perform a quick gut check. Ask yourself if reaching for those heavy evidence layers we talked about earlier is actually worth the time for this specific case based on its complexity. It's incredibly elegant in its simplicity, isn't it? By dedicating just 10 minutes a week to this simple ledger, you're actively practicing preemption and provocation. You're training your brain to catch those life-saving discrepancies that others miss. So I'll leave you with this. Are you going to keep relying on a standard single-pass assumption, or are you ready to ruthlessly audit your own reasoning? Take this 10-minute loop into your next shift and see what you've been missing. Thanks for exploring this with me today, and keep learning.